1 year after Prince Arthur died, his mother made a deadly choice. Elizabeth of York was 36 years old when she became pregnant again, not for love, not for duty, but because her youngest son Henry wasn't enough to secure the Tudor throne. She retreated to the Tower of London in February 1503, desperately hoping to deliver another male heir. Instead, she delivered her own death sentence. Within days, both her newborn daughter and Elizabeth herself were dead. She died on her 37th birthday, and her husband, King Henry VII, never recovered. He became a tyrant, and the 11-year-old boy left behind, he would become Henry VIII. April 2nd, 1502. Ludlow Castle, on the Welsh border. Prince Arthur Tudor, heir to the English throne, was dying. He was 15 years old. Just 5 months earlier, he had married the Spanish Princess Catherine of Aragon in a ceremony that promised to unite England with the most powerful empire in Europe. Now he lay in his bedchamber, his body burning with fever, his skin drenched in sweat that wouldn't stop coming. They called it the sweating sickness. It arrived without warning and killed without mercy. One moment you felt fine. The next, your head pounded, your limbs ached, and sweat poured from your body until you collapsed from exhaustion. Some died within 3 hours. Others lasted a day. Almost no one survived once the symptoms began. Catherine of Aragon caught it too. She lay in her own chamber, fighting the same disease that was killing her husband. But somehow, she survived. Arthur did not. When the news reached Westminster Palace, King Henry VII broke down in front of his entire court. This was a man who never showed emotion. A man who had fought for his crown on a battlefield and worn it with cold calculation ever since. But when his counselors told him his eldest son was dead, Henry collapsed into sobs so violent that his advisors didn't know what to do. His wife, Queen Elizabeth of York, rushed to comfort him. She held him while he wept and told him they were both still young enough to have more children. She reminded him they still had a son, 10-year-old Henry, Duke of York. He could be trained to become king. But even as she spoke those words, Elizabeth knew the truth. One son wasn't enough. Not for a dynasty this fragile. The Tudors had only held the throne for 17 years. Henry VII had won it through conquest, not inheritance. Half the nobility still whispered that he was a usurper, that the Yorks had a better claim, that the Plantagenets should return. Arthur's birth had silenced those whispers. A strong, educated, legitimate male heir meant the Tudor line was secure. Now Arthur was gone. And 10-year-old Prince Henry was never supposed to be king. He'd been raised as the spare, sent to study theology and music, while Arthur learned statecraft and diplomacy. He was charming and athletic, yes, but utterly unprepared for the weight of a crown. The succession hung by a thread. One illness, one accident, one assassin's blade. That's all it would take to end the Tudor dynasty forever. Henry VII knew it. Elizabeth of York knew it. And within months, the Queen would make a choice that would cost her everything. She would try to give England another heir. One last son to secure the throne. One final pregnancy to save the future. It would kill her. By summer, Elizabeth of York was pregnant again. She was 36 years old. In an age where most women were grandmothers by that age, Elizabeth was preparing for her 7th childbirth. She'd already given Henry 4 children who survived infancy: Arthur, Margaret, Henry, and Mary. She'd buried 2 others. Her body had been through this 6 times before. But this time felt different. This wasn't the hopeful first pregnancy when Arthur was born, securing the union of York and Lancaster. This wasn't even duty. This was desperation dressed up as optimism. The court knew it. The physicians knew it. And deep down, Elizabeth knew it too. Royal pregnancies were always dangerous. Even young, healthy women died in childbirth regularly. Infection, hemorrhaging, exhaustion, any of these could kill a queen as easily as a peasant. But at 36, after 6 previous pregnancies, Elizabeth's body was worn down. Every birth weakened a woman. Every recovery took longer. And yet she had no choice. The Tudor claim to the throne was still fragile. Henry VII had won his crown by killing Richard III at Bosworth Field, not by inheriting it. He'd married Elizabeth to unite the warring houses of Lancaster and York, to give his children a legitimacy he lacked. But legitimacy meant nothing if there was no one left to inherit. Young Prince Henry was healthy now, but he was only 10 years old. What if he caught the same sweating sickness that killed Arthur? What if he fell from a horse, or drowned, or was struck down by any of the 1,000 dangers that claimed children's lives? The dynasty needed insurance. Another son. A backup heir. Someone to guarantee the Tudor line wouldn't die with one fever. So Elizabeth withdrew from public life as her belly grew. Pregnancy required seclusion, especially for a queen. By late January 1503, she made her way to the Tower of London for her official confinement. The Tower wasn't the grim fortress of executions it would later become under her son's reign. For Elizabeth, it was a royal residence, a place where queens traditionally withdrew to give birth in privacy and safety. Her apartments were prepared with care. The royal embroiderer, a man named Robinet, had created a magnificent new bed for her. The curtains were decorated with clouds and roses, symbols of heaven and the Tudor dynasty. Everything was ready. The midwives were on standby. The physicians were close. The expected due date was late February, which meant Elizabeth would spend about a month in confinement before labor began. That was the plan. But plans meant nothing when your body decided otherwise. On February 2nd, just 1 week after arriving at the Tower, Elizabeth went into labor. Either the physicians had miscalculated, or the baby was coming early. Either way, there was no time to prepare. The Queen was about to deliver her final child. The labor came suddenly, violently, without warning. Elizabeth's attendants rushed to her side as the contractions began. There was no gradual build, no gentle onset. Her body had simply decided it was time. The midwives worked quickly, but everyone in that chamber knew something was wrong. This was too early, too fast, too desperate. After hours of labor, Elizabeth delivered a daughter. They named her Catherine. Some historians believe it was to honor Catherine of Aragon, Arthur's widow, the Spanish princess who had survived the same sickness that killed her husband. Others think it was simply a name Elizabeth had always loved. Either way, the infant princess was here, but she wasn't thriving. In the days following the birth, it became clear that something was terribly wrong with both mother and child. The baby was weak. She wouldn't nurse properly. She barely cried. And Elizabeth experienced in childbirth, strong despite her age, wasn't recovering the way she should. Fever set in. Pain radiated through her body. The bleeding wouldn't stop completely, and when it did, it started again. Medieval physicians had no understanding of infection, no concept of hemorrhaging beyond what they could see. All they knew was that the Queen was declining, and the infant princess was fading. Panic spread through the Tower. A messenger was dispatched urgently to Kent, riding hard to find a physician named Aylesworth, or possibly Hallingsworth. The records aren't clear. Someone had heard this doctor had experience with difficult births, with mothers who couldn't recover. It was a desperate measure, sending for help outside the royal physicians already present. But desperation was all they had left. Inside the royal apartments, Elizabeth held her daughter when she had the strength. She'd done this 6 times before. She knew what a healthy newborn looked like, how they moved, how they fed. Catherine wasn't doing any of those things right. The baby's breathing was shallow, her skin too pale, her tiny body growing weaker by the hour. Elizabeth must have known. After 6 previous births, after losing 2 children already, she must have recognized the signs. Her daughter was dying, and she was too weak to stop it. February 10th arrived cold and gray. 8 days after her birth, Princess Catherine stopped breathing. The infant who was supposed to save the Tudor dynasty lasted just over a week. Her tiny body was prepared for burial, while her mother lay in the same apartments, barely clinging to consciousness. Elizabeth of York had given everything to secure her husband's throne. She'd married the man who defeated her uncle. She'd borne him 7 children. She'd united 2 warring houses with her bloodline. And now her body was failing. The physicians did what they could, but medieval medicine was useless against what was happening inside her. Childbed fever, hemorrhaging, sheer exhaustion. Whatever the cause, Elizabeth was slipping away. And the next day was her birthday. She would turn 37 if she survived the night. She didn't survive the night. February 11th, 1503. Elizabeth of York died in the medieval Queen's lodgings at the Tower of London. The same day she turned 37. The same bed where she'd given birth 9 days earlier became the place where she took her last breath. The woman who united the houses of York and Lancaster was gone. The Queen who had given Henry VII legitimacy, who had borne him 7 children, who had stood beside him through 17 years of uncertainty dead, and lying in a nearby chamber, wrapped in cloth and waiting for burial, was the infant daughter who had died just hours before her. 2 bodies, 2 funerals, 2 coffins that represented the complete destruction of everything Henry VII had tried to protect. The king was informed immediately. No one knew how to tell a man he'd de-lost both his wife and newborn daughter within a single day. Especially a man like Henry controlled, calculated, a king who ruled through cold precision rather than passion. But when the news reached him, that control shattered completely. Within 12 months, Henry VII had buried his eldest son and his wife, Arthur, the heir he'd spent 15 years preparing for kingship. Elizabeth, the woman who had given his reign legitimacy and filled his court with children. Both gone, both dead before their time. Both taken by forces he couldn't control, couldn't negotiate with, couldn't defeat. The Tower of London, normally bustling with servants and courtiers, fell silent. Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting wept openly. Her daughters Margaret and Mary were brought to their mother's chamber to say goodbye. 11-year-old Prince Henry stood in that room, staring at the bed where his mother had died, trying to understand how everything had fallen apart so quickly. He'd already lost Arthur just a year ago. Now his mother. The 2 people who had shaped his childhood, gone within 12 months. And his father, the distant, stern king who rarely showed affection, was somewhere in the palace, locked away, refusing to speak to anyone. The funeral arrangements began immediately. A queen's death required ceremony, required spectacle, required the kingdom to witness the end of an era. But Henry VII couldn't face it yet. He retreated to a private chamber and ordered everyone to leave him alone. Outside, London began to mourn. Elizabeth had been beloved in ways Henry never was. She was the York princess who had ended the Wars of the Roses with her marriage. She was the mother of England's future. She was the gentle presence behind a harsh king's throne. And now she was gone, along with the baby daughter who might have secured the dynasty's future. The Tudor line rested entirely on one boy now, one 11-year-old prince who just watched his family collapse around him. One future king who was learning that loss could destroy even the most powerful men in England. That lesson would stay with him forever. For days, no one saw the king. Henry VII had withdrawn to a private chamber deep within the palace. He'd given explicit orders, no visitors, no counselors, no servants, unless absolutely necessary. The man who had built his entire reign on control and calculation had completely vanished from public life. His advisors waited nervously outside. England couldn't function without its king. Documents needed signing. Decisions needed making. Foreign ambassadors needed audiences. But the door stayed closed, and the silence from within grew heavier with each passing hour. When Henry finally emerged weeks later, His court barely recognized him. His hair, once dark brown, had turned completely white. Deep lines creased his face where smooth skin had been before. He moved slowly, as if the weight of grief had physically aged him decades in a matter of days. Courtiers who saw him whispered in shock. This wasn't the same man who had ruled England with an iron grip for 17 years. An illuminated manuscript created shortly after Elizabeth's death captured the full horror of the king's mourning. The image shows Henry in dark robes, his face etched with a sorrow so profound it seems to radiate from the page. His expression isn't just sad, it's hollow, emptied out, destroyed. This was unprecedented. Kings didn't show emotion like this. They mourned privately, maintained dignity publicly, and moved forward because the realm required it. But Henry VII couldn't move forward. He was trapped in a grief so consuming it paralyzed him. His counselors tried to reach him. They reminded him gently that he still had 3 living children, Prince Henry, Princess Margaret, and Princess Mary. They told him the kingdom needed his leadership. They suggested carefully that he might consider remarrying to secure the succession further. Henry barely acknowledged them. The man who had once controlled every detail of his government now let others make decisions in his name. He attended council meetings like a ghost, present in body, but absent in spirit. When he did speak, his voice was flat, emotionless, as if something fundamental inside him had simply stopped working. And the worst was yet to come. Within months of Elizabeth's death, Princess Margaret had to fulfill a marriage contract that had been negotiated years earlier. At 13 years old, she was escorted north to Scotland to marry King James IV. It was a political alliance Henry himself had arranged, one he couldn't break even in his grief. So he watched his daughter leave for a foreign country, knowing he would likely never see her again. Royal daughters who married foreign kings rarely returned home. Margaret wrote letters back to England, pleading with her father, telling him how much she missed her family, how lonely she felt so far from home. Henry read those letters in his private chambers and did nothing. He couldn't protect her. He couldn't bring her back. He couldn't fix anything anymore. All he could do was grieve. And eventually, that grief would transform into something much darker. While Henry VII mourned alone, his children faced their mother's death in a very different way. The same illuminated manuscript that shows the king in his mourning robes also depicts what happened in Elizabeth's final chamber. 2 young girls sit on the floor wearing black veils that cover their faces. Princess Margaret and Princess Mary, clutching each other in shared devastation, surrounded by the empty space where their mother should be. But the most haunting image is the boy at the bed. Prince Henry, 11 years old, is shown draped across the sheets of his mother's deathbed, his body collapsed in grief, his face pressed into the fabric as if trying to find some trace of her still lingering there. His small frame looks impossibly fragile against the grandeur of the royal bedchamber. This wasn't supposed to be his life. Just 2 years earlier, Prince Henry had been the spare heir, the charming younger brother who could afford to study music and theology while Arthur handled the serious business of kingship. He'd been free in ways Arthur never was free to joust, to compose songs, to be a child instead of a future monarch. Then Arthur died, and suddenly Henry was thrust into a role he'd never prepared for. Now his mother was gone too, and the one person who might have guided him through this impossible transition no longer existed. Elizabeth had been warm where Henry VII was cold. She'd been affectionate where the king was distant. For an 11-year-old boy, suddenly expected to become England's future, losing her was catastrophic. No one thought to ask how young Henry was processing any of this. Royal children weren't coddled. They weren't given time to grieve properly. They were expected to maintain composure, attend the funeral, accept their new reality, and move forward. But grief doesn't work that way, especially for children. Prince Henry had watched his older brother die from a disease no one understood. He'd seen his mother grow desperate to replace Arthur, had watched her body swell with pregnancy despite the danger. He'd been there when the news came that both his infant sister and his mother were dead. And now he stood in a dark chamber, staring at an empty bed, trying to make sense of a world that kept taking people away from him. Years later, when another death triggered painful memories, King Henry VIII would admit that the loss of his mother had wounded him deeply. That moment in the chamber, pressed against her deathbed, surrounded by his grieving sisters, never fully left him. Psychologists today would recognize the signs of childhood trauma. Losing a parent at 11, especially after losing a sibling just a year earlier, fundamentally changes how a child develops emotionally. It creates wounds that never fully heal, fears that never fully fade. But in 1503, no one understood trauma. They just expected Prince Henry to grow up, take the throne when his time came, and rule England successfully. They had no idea what kind of king that grieving boy would become. Elizabeth of York's funeral was a spectacle of grief turned into public ceremony. The procession stretched through London streets, a river of black cloth and solemn faces moving toward Westminster Abbey. Her coffin, draped in velvet and cloth of gold, was carried by the highest nobles in the realm. Hundreds of candles flickered in the winter air. Bells tolled across the city in a rhythm that felt like England's heartbeat slowing to a stop. Henry VII had spared no expense. If he couldn't save his wife, he could at least honor her death with the grandest funeral a queen had ever received. It was his final gift to her, a public declaration of the love he'd been too reserved to show while she lived. The ceremony at Westminster was elaborate, carefully choreographed, every detail planned to reflect Elizabeth's importance. She wasn't just a queen. She was the living symbol of peace between York and Lancaster. Her marriage to Henry had ended 30 years of civil war. Her children represented the hope that England would never tear itself apart again. Now that symbol was being lowered into a tomb. The court stood in silence as prayers were recited. Prince Henry watched his mother disappear beneath stone, his young face carefully blank. He'd already learned the first rule of kingship: never let them see you break. But inside, something was fracturing that no amount of royal composure could hide. After the funeral, life was supposed to return to normal. The court was supposed to move forward. But normal no longer existed. Princess Margaret's departure for Scotland came just months later. The marriage contract couldn't be delayed, even though the family was still shattered by loss. At 13, Margaret was dressed in traveling clothes, surrounded by attendants, and escorted north toward a country she'd never seen to marry a king she'd never met. She cried when she left. The records are clear about that. Margaret Tudor, normally composed and regal like her mother, broke down as she said goodbye to her father and siblings. She begged to stay longer. She asked if she could delay the journey just a few more weeks. But political alliances don't bend for grief. The letters she sent back to England were heartbreaking. She wrote to her father describing the coldness of the Scottish court, the loneliness of being so far from family, the desperate homesickness that consumed her. She signed them with phrases like "your humble daughter" and "longing to see you again." Henry VII read those letters and couldn't respond with anything but formal pleasantries. What could he say? That he missed her too? That he regretted sending her away? That he wished he could undo the marriage contract and bring her home? He couldn't do any of those things. He was a king first, a father second. So Margaret stayed in Scotland, and Henry stayed in England, and the family Elizabeth had built continued to disintegrate piece by piece. And through it all, the king's grief was slowly curdling into something else entirely. The man who emerged from grief was not the man who had entered it. Henry VII had always been cautious, calculating, careful with trust. He'd won his throne on a battlefield against a king with a stronger claim, and he'd spent 17 years looking over his shoulder for the next pretender, the next rebellion, the next threat. But Elizabeth had softened those edges. Her presence at court had given him something beyond political survival: a family, a partnership, a reason to build rather than simply defend. Without her, those edges came back sharper than before. The king withdrew further into himself. He attended fewer public events. He took meals alone. When he did appear at court, he was distant and unreachable, his face an expressionless mask that revealed nothing. The advisers who had once been able to read his moods, to anticipate his decisions, now found themselves dealing with a stranger. His behavior grew erratic in subtle ways. He became obsessed with security, with threats real and imagined. He questioned the loyalty of men who had served him faithfully for years. He saw conspiracy in ordinary disagreements and rebellion in minor criticisms. The warmth Elizabeth had brought to the royal household vanished entirely. There were no more family dinners, no more celebrations, no more moments where the king allowed himself to simply be a husband and father. Those roles had died with Elizabeth. All that remained was the crown, and the man crushed beneath its weight. Prince Henry grew up in this new, colder court, where his mother had encouraged his interests, praised his talents, and provided affection. His father now kept him at arm's length. The king was training an heir, not raising a son. Every interaction was formal, measured, designed to prepare the boy for kingship rather than comfort him through loss. It was a lonely existence for both of them. Historians looking back at this period describe Henry VII as increasingly paranoid and isolated during his final years. The confident king who had stabilized England after decades of civil war seemed to fade, replaced by a suspicious, withdrawn figure who trusted no one. But calling it paranoia misses the deeper truth. Henry wasn't losing his mind, he was losing his will. The things that had motivated him for nearly 2 decades were gone. Arthur, the heir he'd groomed for greatness. Elizabeth, the wife who had legitimized his reign and given him purpose beyond mere survival. Even Margaret, now hundreds of miles away in Scotland. What was left? A throne he'd never fully wanted, and a son he barely knew how to reach. So Henry retreated behind walls of silence and solitude, ruling England through intermediaries, making decisions with cold efficiency but no passion. He functioned. He governed. He survived, but he was no longer truly living. And in that isolation, something dangerous was taking root. A bitterness, a resentment, a willingness to hurt others because he himself had been hurt beyond repair. The tyrant was coming. 18 months after Elizabeth's death, England began to notice something had changed about their king. It started with the fines. Noble families who had served Henry VII loyally for years suddenly found themselves accused of minor legal infractions they'd never heard of. Ancient laws no one had enforced in decades were suddenly being applied with ruthless precision. A lord who forgot to renew a land license. A merchant whose paperwork was technically incomplete. A bishop whose taxes were filed 1 day late. The penalties were crushing. Not warnings, not small fees. Massive financial punishments designed to cripple entire households. And behind every fine stood 2 men, Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson. Dudley had been a loyal counselor for years, a competent administrator who understood law and finance. Empson was a skilled lawyer who had served on the king's judicial tribunal. Both were intelligent, efficient, and utterly ruthless. And now Henry VII had unleashed them on England with a single devastating instruction. Extract everything you can. It wasn't about justice. It wasn't even about enforcing the law properly. It was about control through financial terror. If Henry couldn't control death, couldn't save his son or his wife, or hold his family together, he could at least control this. He could make England feel the same helplessness he felt. Dudley operated alone, moving through the kingdom like a shadow, identifying targets, calculating their wealth, determining exactly how much pain he could inflict without quite destroying them. His records were meticulous. Over just 4 years, he personally extracted £219,000 from the English population, nearly twice the king's entire annual income. Think about that number. twice the crown's yearly revenue, pulled directly from the people through fines, penalties, and legal manipulation. Empson worked differently. He led the council learned in the law, the judicial body that was supposed to ensure fairness. Instead, he twisted it into a weapon. Cases were decided before they were heard. Verdicts were written before evidence was presented. If you were brought before Empson's council, you'd already lost. The only question was how much it would cost you. No one was safe. Lords found themselves bankrupted overnight. Merchants saw their businesses destroyed by sudden legal claims. Even clergy supposedly protected by church law were targeted and drained. The spiritual leaders of England, men who had dedicated their lives to God, were treated like criminals and forced to pay massive sums for imaginary offenses. The worst part was the arbitrariness of it all. You couldn't protect yourself by following the law, because the law was whatever Dudley and Empson said it was. You couldn't appeal because the king himself had authorized their actions. You couldn't flee because leaving England without permission was itself an offense that carried penalties. All you could do was wait and hope they didn't notice you. England, which had finally found stability under Henry VII's early reign, was now living in fear of its own government. And the king, locked away in his private chambers, didn't care. Let them suffer. He was suffering too. The system Dudley and Empson created wasn't just cruel, it was efficient. They kept detailed records of everything. Every family's wealth, every merchant's income, every lord's land holdings. They knew exactly who had money and exactly how to legally justify taking it. Their network of informants spread across England, reporting back on any sign of prosperity that could be targeted. If you inherited property, they knew. If your business had a profitable year, they knew. If you received a gift from a relative abroad, they knew. And once they knew, they came for you. The methods were insidious. Sometimes it was a fine for an obscure legal violation. Sometimes it was a forced bond pay the crown a large sum now as insurance against future good behavior, even if you'd done nothing wrong. Sometimes it was simply a reassessment of taxes based on deliberately inflated estimates of your wealth. And there was no appeal process that mattered. Empson controlled the judicial council that was supposed to provide oversight. Challenging a fine meant appearing before the very man who had issued it, in a court where the verdict was predetermined. People learned quickly that fighting back only made things worse. Contemporary records describe their actions as contrary to the right and to the order of the law. Even other royal officials, men who served Henry VII loyally, were horrified by what Dudley and Empson were doing. But no one dared speak up publicly, because speaking up meant becoming a target yourself. The fear became pervasive. Noble families stopped displaying their wealth openly, afraid it would attract attention. Merchants underreported their profits, knowing that success meant punishment. People began hiding money, burying valuables, doing anything to avoid appearing prosperous enough to be worth targeting. England's economy began to suffer. Why invest in your business if the profits would just be seized? Why improve your land if it meant higher assessments and more fines? The entrepreneurial energy that had been growing during the early part of Henry's reign started to wither under the weight of constant financial terror. And still, Dudley and Empson continued. They weren't corrupt in the traditional sense. They weren't stealing the money for themselves. Every penny they extracted went to the royal treasury. They were true believers in their mission, convinced they were serving their king faithfully by crushing anyone who might pose a threat. Because that's what this was really about. Not revenue, not law enforcement. Control through fear. Henry VII had learned that loyalty couldn't be trusted, that family could be taken away, that nothing in life was certain. So he would make his subjects feel that same uncertainty. He would make them understand that prosperity, security, even basic peace could vanish at any moment. If he couldn't have stability, neither could they. The king who had once promised to heal England after decades of civil war was now inflicting a different kind of violence. Not with swords and battles, but with ledgers and legal documents. Not with armies, but with accountants. And somehow, that made it even worse. By 1507, England had become a nation that flinched at the sound of official footsteps. The transformation was complete. What had started as targeted enforcement against a few noble families had metastasized into systematic oppression that touched every level of society. No one was exempt. No one was safe. The question wasn't if Dudley and Empson would come for you. It was when. Poor men found themselves dragged into court for offenses they couldn't even comprehend. A farmer accused of encroaching on crown land he'd worked for generations. A craftsman charged with violating guild regulations he'd never heard of. The fines were often more than these men earned in a year, forcing them to sell everything they owned or face imprisonment. Wealthy merchants fared no better. Their success made them obvious targets. A successful wool trader in London suddenly received notice that his export licenses were invalid and owed back penalties. A shipping merchant discovered that cargo he'd transported years ago had violated obscure customs laws. The amounts demanded were staggering, designed to transfer wealth from private hands to the royal treasury in one devastating stroke. Even the church wasn't spared. Bishops and abbots, who had believed their spiritual authority offered protection, learned otherwise. They were assessed for taxes based on wildly inflated estimates of church income. When they protested, they were reminded that defying the king's agents was itself an offense. Several high-ranking clergy members were forced to pay enormous sums to avoid charges of disloyalty. The psychological toll was perhaps worse than the financial one. England had endured civil war. It had survived battles, sieges, and political chaos. But this was different. This was your own government turning against you for no reason other than you existed and had something worth taking. People stopped trusting their neighbors. What if that friendly conversation was being reported? What if mentioning your successful harvest led to an inflated tax assessment? What if helping a friend in need drew official attention? Paranoia infected communities that had once been close-knit. And through it all, Henry VII remained distant and unreachable. He rarely appeared in public anymore. When he did, he was gaunt and hollow-eyed, a ghost of the vigorous man who had claimed the throne 24 years earlier. Some whispered that he was ill. Others said he'd simply given up on everything except maintaining control. The court itself had become a miserable place. The laughter and music that Elizabeth had encouraged were gone. Nobles attended out of obligation, not desire, spending as little time as possible in the king's presence before fleeing back to their estates. And even there, they weren't truly safe. Prince Henry watched all of this unfold. He was 16 now, old enough to understand what his father had become. Old enough to see how grief had curdled into cruelty. Old enough to witness what absolute power looked like when wielded by a broken man. The lessons were sinking in, though not the ones Henry VII might have intended. The boy was learning that kings could do anything. That power, once obtained, could be used without restraint. That pain justified cruelty. Those lessons would shape the rest of English history. April 21st, 1509. Henry VII died at Richmond Palace, aged 52. He'd ruled for nearly 24 years, but only the first 17 really mattered. Everything after Elizabeth's death was just slow decline, a king going through the motions, while the man inside withered away. By the end, he was so frail that courtiers barely recognized him. The white hair, the deeply lined face, the body that seemed to fold in on itself. This wasn't age. This was what unresolved grief looks like when it consumes someone completely. The moment news of his death spread through the palace, his 17-year-old son made his first decision as king. Arrest Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson. The order came swiftly, decisively, with none of the hesitation you might expect from a teenage boy suddenly thrust onto the throne. Young Henry knew exactly what he was doing. He'd watched these men terrorize England for 6 years. He'd seen the fear in people's eyes when their names were mentioned. He understood that his reign needed to begin differently than his father's had ended. Within hours, both men were imprisoned in the Tower of London, the same fortress where Elizabeth of York had died trying to secure the succession, the same place where this entire tragedy had begun. The charges against them were deliberately vague treason, effectively, though the specifics hardly mattered. Everyone knew what this was really about. They were scapegoats for Henry VII's oppressive final years. They would die so the new king could distance himself from his father's cruelty. And die they did. Both men were executed in 1510, their heads displayed publicly as a message to England. The reign of terror was over. The new King Henry promised to be different, generous, just, merciful. For a few years, he actually was. But the damage had been done in ways no one fully understood yet. Prince Henry hadn't just watched his father descend into tyranny. He'd learned from it. He'd seen how grief could transform into cruelty, how loss could justify punishment, how a king who felt powerless over his own life could exert absolute power over others. Those lessons were stored away, dormant but not forgotten. The boy who had wept on his mother's deathbed was now King Henry VIII. He'd survived losing his brother, his mother, his infant sister. He'd endured watching his father become a monster. He'd grown up in a court where love was dangerous because it made you vulnerable, where attachment meant inevitable pain. And somewhere deep inside, a question had taken root. If everyone you love eventually dies or leaves, why not take what you want when you want it? Why not use power without restraint? Why not become the kind of king who makes others feel the fear and helplessness you once felt? Dudley and Empson were dead. Henry VII was dead. But the lessons they'd taught were very much alive. And England would spend the next 38 years learning just how well Henry VIII had learned them. Elizabeth of York had done everything a Tudor queen was expected to do, and more. She'd married the man who defeated her family. Henry VII had killed her uncle Richard III in battle, claimed the throne by conquest, and then needed her royal York bloodline to legitimize his rule. Elizabeth could have resisted. She could have refused. But instead, she chose to become the bridge between two warring houses, the living symbol of peace after 30 years of bloodshed. She gave him 7 pregnancies over 16 years. Arthur in 1486, securing the succession almost immediately. Margaret in 1489. Henry in 1491. Then Mary, Edmund, who died young, and another daughter, Catherine, who also died in infancy. Each pregnancy carried risk. Each birth weakened her body a little more. But she'd accepted that risk because producing heirs was her duty. More than duty, though. Elizabeth had genuinely tried to build something good from the wreckage of civil war. Contemporary accounts describe her as gracious, kind, beloved by common people in ways Henry VII never was. She'd used her position to soften her husband's harsher edges, to bring warmth to a court that otherwise ran on cold political calculation. She'd succeeded, too. For 17 years, the Tudor court had been stable. Henry had someone he trusted absolutely. The children had a mother who balanced their father's emotional distance. England had a queen who represented hope instead of division. And then Arthur died, and Elizabeth made the choice that would kill her. She was 36 years old. Most women her age were grandmothers, finished with childbearing, preparing to guide the next generation. Her body had already been through 6 full-term pregnancies. Medical understanding of the time would have told anyone that another pregnancy was dangerous. But she became pregnant anyway. Whether it was duty, desperation, or genuine belief she could secure the dynasty one final time, we'll never know. What we do know is that she went through with it despite every warning sign her body must have been giving her. She retreated to the Tower in late January 1503, prepared for confinement, commissioned that beautiful bed with clouds and roses embroidered on the curtains. She was ready to deliver another child for England, another heir to guarantee the Tudor future. Instead, she delivered her own death. The baby came too early, or the calculations were wrong. Princess Catherine lived 8 days. Elizabeth lasted just one more, and the dynasty she de-sacrificed everything to protect was suddenly more fragile than it had been before she'd gotten pregnant. Henry VII fell apart. Prince Henry lost the one parent who'd shown him genuine affection. Margaret was sent to Scotland. The family structure that Elizabeth had built through sheer will and grace simply collapsed without her. She'd done everything right, followed every expectation, fulfilled every duty, made every sacrifice a queen could make, and it still wasn't enough to save anyone. Before Elizabeth's death, before the desperate final pregnancy, there was Arthur's illness, and that illness had a name that terrified everyone who heard it: the sweating sickness. It appeared in England in 1485 and returned in waves throughout the Tudor period, killing thousands each time. No one understood what caused it. No one knew how to treat it. And no one could predict who would survive and who would die within hours of the first symptoms appearing. The disease moved with horrifying speed. You'd wake up feeling fine, then suddenly your head would start pounding. Within minutes, pain shot through your limbs like your bones were breaking from the inside. Your heart would race, beating so fast you could feel it in your throat. Then came the thirst desperate, unquenchable, followed by exhaustion, so profound you could barely keep your eyes open. And then the sweating began. Not normal perspiration. A deluge of sweat that soaked through clothing, through bedding, through everything. Your body would pour out fluid until you were drenched and shaking, too weak to move, too disoriented to call for help. Some people died within 3 hours of the first symptom. Others lasted a full day. Almost no one lasted longer. The wealthy died more frequently than the poor, which made the disease even more terrifying for noble families like the Tudors. It seemed to prefer strong, healthy young men, exactly the demographic Arthur Tudor belonged to. Some historians now speculate it might have been a hantavirus spread by rodents, concentrated in areas where the wealthy lived because their grain stores attracted more rats. But in 1502, no one knew any of that. All they knew was that people were dying faster than priests could administer last rites. When the sickness hit Ludlow Castle that April, both Arthur and Catherine of Aragon fell ill. They were isolated in separate chambers, attended by physicians who had no idea what to do beyond keeping them comfortable and praying. Catherine, just 16 years old and married to Arthur for less than 5 months, somehow fought through it. Her body burned with fever, then slowly, miraculously, began to recover. Arthur didn't. On April 2nd, 1502, the Prince of Wales died at just 15 years old, his body ravaged by a disease that medical science wouldn't understand for another 500 years. If that virus had taken Catherine instead of Arthur, everything would have been different. Elizabeth wouldn't have needed another pregnancy. She would have lived. Henry VII wouldn't have descended into tyranny. Young Prince Henry would have grown up in a stable household with both parents, maybe learned different lessons about power and loss. But viruses don't care about alternative histories. The sweating sickness killed Arthur Tudor, and that single death set everything else in motion. The desperate pregnancy, the double funeral, the grief-stricken king, the traumatized prince, the reign of terror. One disease, one death, an entire dynasty altered forever. And England would pay the price for the next 40 years. There's an image that haunts Tudor history. An 11-year-old boy collapsed across his dead mother's bed, his small body shaking with grief, his face buried in sheets that still smell like her. That boy was Prince Henry, and that moment shaped the king he would become more than any lesson in statecraft or theology ever could. Psychologists today recognize what happened to him as complex childhood trauma. Losing a sibling, then a parent, within 12 months, at an age when you're just beginning to understand mortality that fundamentally rewires how a developing brain processes attachment, loss, and control. But in 1503, there was no such thing as childhood psychology. There was no concept of giving a grieving child time to process his emotions or space to heal. There was only expectation. Arthur was dead, so Henry was now the heir. Elizabeth was dead, so he needed to grow up faster. Grief was a luxury princes couldn't afford, so Henry did what was expected. He attended the funerals. He stood solemnly during ceremonies. He accepted his new role as Duke of Cornwall and heir to the throne. He moved through his days with the composure required of royalty. But inside, something was breaking that would never fully heal. Contemporary records describe the teenage Prince Henry as increasingly isolated. His mother, who had been affectionate and warm, was gone. His father, who had always been distant, now became completely unreachable, locked away in private chambers with his grief. Margaret was sent to Scotland. Arthur was dead. Even little Mary, his youngest sister, was kept separate most of the time, according to court protocol. The boy who should have been surrounded by family grew up essentially alone. Years later, something happened that revealed just how deeply his mother's death had wounded him. In 1506, Archduke Philip of Burgundy died suddenly. He was young, powerful, seemingly healthy one day and dead the next. When King Henry VIII heard the news, witnesses reported that he became visibly shaken, not because he'd been particularly close to Philip, but because the sudden death triggered something. He admitted later that it brought back the pain of losing his mother, that the memory of her death, sudden, unexpected, devastating, had never really left him. It was just buried beneath years of royal duty and emotional suppression. That's what unprocessed trauma does. It waits. It lurks beneath the surface, influencing decisions and reactions in ways you don't fully understand. It makes you afraid of attachment, because attachment means vulnerability. It makes you crave control, because loss taught you how powerless you really are. The boy weeping on his mother's deathbed grew into a man who would marry 6 times, desperate for the family stability he'd lost. Who would execute people on suspicion alone, because he'd learned that everyone eventually leaves. Who would tear apart an entire church to get what he wanted, because childhood taught him that following the rules didn't protect anyone. Henry VIII's cruelty didn't come from nowhere. It came from that chamber at the Tower, from that empty bed, from that moment when an 11-year-old learned that love always ends in loss. Elizabeth of York died on February 11th, 1503, believing she was saving the Tudor dynasty. She was wrong. Her death didn't secure the throne, it poisoned it. The sacrifice she made, the final pregnancy she endured at 36, despite the risks, didn't protect her family. It destroyed them. Her husband became a tyrant. Her son became a trauma survivor who would grow into one of England's most infamous kings. Her daughter Margaret was exiled to Scotland, lonely and homesick for the rest of her life. A dynasty Elizabeth died trying to protect became synonymous with cruelty, paranoia, and bloodshed. Henry VIII would eventually execute 2 of his 6 wives. He would break England away from the Catholic Church, not for theology, but for personal desire. He would order the deaths of trusted advisors, close friends, even family members when they displeased him. Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, Thomas Cromwell, Catherine Howard, the list of people Henry VIII destroyed, reads like a catalogue of Tudor tragedy. And it all traces back to that February night at the Tower of London. Historians debate what made Henry VIII the way he was. Some point to a jousting accident in 1536 that may have caused brain damage. Others focus on his desperation for a male heir, the same desperation that killed his mother. Some argue he was simply a narcissist who happened to have absolute power. But look at the timeline. The charming, generous young king who took the throne in 1509 genuinely tried to be different from his father. For years, he succeeded. He was athletic, educated, charismatic, everything Arthur had been training to be, everything England hoped for in a monarch. The cruelty came later, and it came in patterns that echo his childhood trauma. The obsessive need for control, the paranoia about succession, the willingness to destroy anyone who made him feel vulnerable or powerless, the inability to process loss in healthy ways. Those aren't just personality flaws. They're survival mechanisms developed by a child who learned that the people you love die, that duty demands sacrifice even when it kills you, that power is the only thing that doesn't abandon you. Elizabeth of York, as final act getting pregnant at 36 to secure the throne, taught her son the worst possible lesson, that people are expendable in service of the dynasty. That sacrifice is always noble, even when it's fatal. That the crown matters more than the person wearing it. Henry VIII learned those lessons well. Too well. So when we remember Elizabeth of York, we shouldn't just remember her as the gentle queen who united York and Lancaster. We should remember her as the woman whose death created a monster. Not intentionally, not directly, but undeniably. She died trying to save the Tudor throne. Instead, she cursed it. And England would bleed for that curse for the next 4 decades.